something out of his pocket and dropped it on the ground, and he kept going. He'd be going along, and some people hold their rods like this, others like this. There's all kinds of different ways. Happen again. And I'm watching his hands now because my skepticism is kind of turning toward fascination a little bit. How's he doing that? How's he making that happen? How's he affecting that? And down it would drop again. Well, anyway, cut a long story short. He came back and told Jimmy the excavator and me, he said, okay, what you have here is a stream. It's about X number of feet down. It has an L shape to it. It's a really good flow. It's this, that, and the other thing. So if you dig over here and you do this over there, and I paid him and he left and never saw him again. I wonder if he's still around. And they came with the backhoe and they dug it up, and it was exactly where this guy said everything was. Exactly. And so now fascination turned into something else. I was pretty riveted. And I thought about it, and I thought, man, that is a beautiful metaphor for writing. It's almost a beautiful metaphor for anything, where you can kind of see through to something that you shouldn't be able to see through to. So I thought about it metaphorically for a while, and then wrote another book about something else. But I had some notes. And then one day I thought, let me try to write this out a little bit. And Diviner's Tale came out of that experience. I actually went up to the American Society of Dowsers and took a beginner's class in dowsing, and I have a certificate as a dowser. I would not hire myself out to you guys. And it's also something that in New York City has limited, although people get out there, they'll use a pendulum to figure out what they're going to eat off of, on a menu, or what they're going to wear that day when they get up. So people get into it. Let me read just a little bit from the book. I'm going to start by reading two epigraphs from the novel. I don't usually do that, but these two seem to me like so central, so important, so they were so informing to me. I kept them, by me while I was writing the book. And then what I'll do is I'll read from the beginning, because with a novel, as my old friend Patrick McGraw once said, at least when you do that, it's only bleeding from one end. I'll read the opening, and then what I'll do is I'll just skip ahead a few pages so that you can see or hear the outcome of what happens in this opening. The novel moves around in other places, and then it comes back to this, and what she thought she saw proves to be something altogether other than that, and then it becomes other again. So the first epigraph is from Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and it goes, "If a man could pass through paradise in a dream and have a flower presented to him as a pledge that his soul had really been there, and found that flower in his hand when he awoke, and what then?" Second quote is from the great German filmmaker Werner Herzog, and that reads, "Everyday life is only an illusion behind which lies the reality of dreams." My father, whom I trust as surely as yesterday happened and tomorrow might not, was the first to call me a witch. He meant it in a loving way, but he meant it. In later years, he'd sometimes say it with a defiant touch of pride. "My daughter, the witch." I brought this on myself by warning my brother Christopher, with all the raw certainty of a 7-year-old who believed she could see things hidden from others, not to go to the movies one August evening with his best friend Ben. He laughed like any older brother twice his sister's age would, and said I could take a metaphysical flying leap. I can still picture him, lanky, loose-jointed, tall as a tree to my eyes, wearing his favorite faded baseball jersey untucked over a pair of worn jeans and scuffed brown boots. "Hey, nutcracker, see you in the afterlife." Turning, he clomped down the porch stairs 2 steps at a time to the waiting car. I remember lying in long orchard grass in the field beyond our house, listening to the restless crickets scraping their bony legs together, and waiting for the meteors to tell me when the worst had come to pass. At first the sky was calm, just an infinity of cold stars and a few winking planets out in the void, carving their paths through the darkness. Maybe I got it wrong, I hoped. But then, so many shooting stars started chasing across the night, I couldn't begin to know which of them had carried my beloved laughing brother away. The crickets stopped their chorus as the whole field sank into silence. I sat up and gasped. How I wished what I saw above me was a great black slate instead of a brilliant light show. Defeated by my vindication, I walked back to the house and sneaked in the side door. "That you, Cass?" my mother called out, my mother who could hear a mouse yawn the next county over. "No," I whispered, not wanting to be me anymore. Christopher never came back. Neither did Ben or Ben's father, Rich Gilchrist, who was the town's supervisor. The funeral was attended by 1,000 people. That happens when you are a well-liked local politician and chief of the volunteer fire department. Not to mention a decorated war veteran. Many men in dress uniforms attended from all over Corinth County in rural upstate New York and across the Delaware into Pennsylvania. Phalanxes of fire trucks bright as polished mirrors lined the road beside the churchyard cemetery. People wept in the wake of all the eulogies, and afterwards the bells tolled. It was the second big funeral in as many years. Emily Schaefer, Chris's classmate, was killed the year before in what some believed was not the accidental death. The authorities declared it, and our town still hadn't recovered. Whereas before we followed one hearse to the cemetery, this year 3 coffins were carried out together after a joint service, one draped with an American flag and 2 smaller unadorned ones behind. To this day, I can hear the bagpipes playing their dirge. Family friends and Christopher's inseparable band of buddies came over to our rambling farmhouse afterward, and everyone ate from a smorgasbord and drank mulled cider and spoke in low, shocked voices. As for myself, I hid upstairs. I felt guilty, bereft, also angry. If he hadn't so simply ignored me, things might have turned out different. I barricaded my door that night and spent hours memorizing my brother's narrow, freckled face, his edgy voice, his gawky mannerisms, his lame jokes, the Christopher-ness of him, so I could hold him as long as possible in the decaying cradle of memory. Instead of sleeping in my bed that night, I lay fitful on the floor, twisting around in my funeral clothes, hugging my doll Millicent, who was my first confidant and imaginary little sister. Why, I thought, should a grieving sibling sleep comfortably when her brother was stuck inside a dark box all alone? I felt hopeless, deeply discouraged. I didn't want my brother to be dead. I didn't want to be a witch. I had no interest in knowing ever again what might happen in this world before it did. My foresight was one thing, but to shift the flow of my brother's will so it might not collide with his fate was as impossible as reaching out to grab one of those falling stars, hold it in my palm, and blow it out. Still would be beyond me had he survived when a woman fell asleep at the wheel and crossed lanes, flying head-on into the Gilchrist's car under a new moon, which is to say, no moon at all. My mother, for all her Christian religion, sank into a numb depression and stayed there for a long time. When I called her Mom, she only sometimes answered. More often, she just looked blankly right through me. She took a year off from her job as a science teacher and spent days doing volunteer work for the church. None of her good deeds, from serving meals at a homeless shelter to clerking in the United Methodist thrift shop, buoyed her spirits. Though I didn't want to believe it, some days I sensed she blamed Christopher's death on me. This she would have denied if asked. I didn't. But it was there in a random gesture, a quiet phrase, a clouded glance. I do know she prayed for me. She told me as much. But I'm glad she prayed in silence. Looking back, I see that I was trying my best to breathe. If it hadn't been for Christopher's death, I probably would not have been raised by my father like I was. In Rosalie's grieving absence, my dad and I reinvented our kinship. He was far too wise to bury his own sorrow by attempting to transform me into some factitious son, tomboy though I admittedly and perhaps inevitably was. High-spirited and gregarious, a magnet to a constant stream of friends, my brother had been nothing like his introverted sister Cassandra, who more often than not kept her own company. Nep did his level best not to Christopherize me, nor did I feel compelled to try to make my father into an older brother figure. Instead, we began hanging out together, a fond parent and his punk kid. He drove me to school and picked me up. Together we made 3-bean chili and shepherd's pie for dinners on the nights when Rosalie arrived home late. We listened avidly to his old jazz records, shunning the 70s pop music that filled the airwaves. Weekends I sat on a tall stool next to him in his repair shop, filled with really just a converted barn near the house, filled with widgets, wires, gadgets, and tools, boxes of tubes, both glass and rubber, 1,000 broken household things he, poor man's Prospero, hoarded for spare parts and used to fix whatever people brought to him that wasn't working. Radios, tractors, toasters, clocks, locks. He even mended a clarinet for some boy in a local marching band. Nep could, I marveled, take almost anything that had fallen into disrepair and make it new again. Young as I was, I recall thinking, he's the last of a breed, Cass. Don't take this for granted. What needs to be said here is this. If I hadn't been fathered so much by him, I might not have become, like him, a diviner. For however skilled he was at transforming the ruined into the running, and however steadfast a husband and father, Nep, shortened from the whimsical, if preposterous, Gabriel Neptune Brooks, was born with a gift that went far toward making those other masteries possible. There had been many diviners in the paternal branch of the family. All had been men. Over the next decade, I became the first female in a lineage that extended unbroken back to the early 19th century, as far as our family tree had been traced. This has been my blessing, my bane, and aside from my own children, my legacy, for better or worse. It was as a diviner I made the discovery on the Henderson land. Before Henderson's, I never had a fear of being alone. Walking in the forest or crossing some unfamiliar field in the pre-dawn morning or darkening night never bothered me. As my father's daughter, I knew the flora and fauna here as well as I knew the names of my sons. I never worried about getting lost because I never got physically lost. Not in the field, not while divining. Besides, worrying never got anybody found. Not that I wasn't used to coming upon things that were unexpected. Calm, quiet, and then the quick stab of discovery, those are for me the two poles of divination. Mine is by definition a loner's trade. The kind of work that involves spending a lot of time both in your head and on your feet, conversing with the invisible and sometimes the inexplicable. How often had I been dowsing a field in search of well water or a mineral deposit or something lost somebody wanted found and thought, nobody's walked here for decades, possibly centuries. So what is this half-buried clawfoot bathtub doing out here in the middle of nowhere? Where is the plow that went with this lonely wheel? You get pretty far out into the wild sometimes when you're hired on with a person who wants to settle fresh terrain. After the Twin Towers went down, I found myself exploring bonier, harsher, uninhabited land for people from the city looking to relocate, to throw for themselves a haven upstate. But even before that, with so many people building their way into the wilderness, developing the backlands, I had been asked by locals to suss out the prospects of one tract or another, analyze what the aquifer was about, the prospects of creating more Waldens in the mountains. And so it wasn't unusual to find myself way off the beaten track. It was the third week of May. Rained overnight. The reeking skunk plants were well up and the delicate jack-in-the-pulpits wagged their cowled heads in the scrub shade. Overhead, mammoth clouds, fringed in silver and charcoal, flew hard and fast toward the Atlantic coast 100 or so miles due east. Noisy warblers flitted in the high branches, redstarts and yellowthroats. Thrushes conversed, invisible in the near distances. The surveyors had finished up a week before I came out. Their day-glow orange flags dangled brazenly from branches, property lines for projected building sites. Here was a 400-plus acre parcel that needed consideration. Maybe a hunter had hammered two boards together on this place once, or some